In the sunlit village of Ashcombe Vale, a beautiful young bride's charm hides a web of betrayal and jealousy until Miss Marple uncovers that love itself can be the deadliest lie of all. Miss Marple and the Bride of Ashcombe Vale welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I am so glad you joined us for today's mystery. Before we began, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lover from all over the world. Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Vale. Ashcombe Vale was not a place where strangers came often. It was the kind of English village that seemed to exist half asleep between one century and the next, where time moved gently and gossip never did. The church bell still marked the hours, the vicar still cycled up the lane in his black coat, and at the post office Miss Copley still knew everyone's secrets, whether they wanted her to or not. It was a bright spring morning when Miss Marple arrived to stay with her cousin, Mrs. Vera Hollingworth, in a small ivy-covered cottage on Elm Row. Mrs. Hollingworth had invited her down for a fortnight's rest, though it was hardly a place for stillness. Between the Women's Guild, the church flowers, and the ceaseless whirl of village chatter, Vera was as busy as any general running a small army. "My dear Jane," she said over tea, pouring with the air of one used to presiding over confidences, "we've a great excitement in the Vale. You couldn't have chosen a better time to visit. Arthur Bennett's come back from London, with a wife." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her eyes mild and blue, though there was a spark of curiosity there. "Arthur Bennett, the gentleman who kept the stationer's shop before his retirement?" "The very same," Vera replied, settling herself with pleasure. "Lost his wife some years ago, poor man. Dreadfully lonely since. And now, out of the blue, he's gone and married again. A young woman from Ceylon, of all places. Imagine that, Jane, a foreign bride in our little Ashcombe Vale." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People are very lonely these days, my dear. Loneliness makes one do curious things." "Quite so, but you should have seen her, pretty as a picture. Dark eyes, the most graceful way of moving, and a voice like honey. She looked far too young to be Mrs. Bennet." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly. "That sort of contrast tends to interest people more than the wedding itself." Indeed, the talk of the village that week revolved almost entirely around Lila Patmore Bennett, the mysterious young bride who had crossed oceans to live among the red-bricked cottages and rose-covered fences of Ashcombe Vale. People met at the grocer's and whispered about her silk saris, about the way she smiled at everyone, yet revealed nothing of herself. "She's polite," said Mrs. Copley at the post office, "but not what you'd call forthcoming, always smiling, but her eyes, oh, there's something behind them." By the time Miss Marple and her cousin took their afternoon walk to the village green, the new Mrs. Bennet had already passed by, umbrella tilted just so, a soft lilac dress catching the sunlight. Arthur Bennett, stout and gentle-faced, walked a step behind her, clearly proud. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted how often the young woman glanced around her, as though checking who might be watching. "She seems uneasy," Miss Marple remarked quietly. "Oh, nonsense," Vera replied. "Anyone would be self-conscious with everyone staring. Still, she does keep herself rather apart, doesn't go to church, and poor Arthur looks thinner already." The days passed, and Miss Marple, as she always did, noticed what others did not. The Bennet's house, Rosebank Cottage, stood near the bend in the lane, its garden overgrown with forget-me-nots and creeping ivy. At first, there were signs of new life, a freshly painted gate, curtains drawn back to let in the sun. But before long, the windows stayed shut, and the garden began to droop again. Sometimes, as Miss Marple took her morning walk, she would see Arthur sitting alone on the bench outside, smoking quietly. Once, she paused to greet him. "Good morning, Mr. Bennet. Settling well, I hope?" He looked up with a weary smile. "Trying to, Miss Marple. It's a bit of an adjustment, you know. Lila finds the English weather a trial." "I expect she does," Miss Marple said kindly. "It can be very grey after all that sunlight." He nodded. Yes, grey. Everything feels grey lately." She left him then, but the remark stayed with her. It was a small thing, but in villages small things are often the first signs of greater ones. By midsummer, whispers began again. Mrs. Bennett had been seen more often in the nearby market town, alone. At the dressmaker's, at the cafe near the station, even at the post office where a parcel had arrived with foreign stamps. Some thought she was homesick, others that she was restless. But no one could say what she did with her long afternoons. "Arthur's worried sick," Mrs. Hollingworth told Miss Marple one evening, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigour. "He told the vicar she's become distant, barely speaks at meals, and they say he caught her writing letters late at night. Foreign letters!" Miss Marple did not look surprised. "Well, my dear Vera, that is sometimes how tragedy begins, when people stop talking to one another." A few nights later, a storm swept through the vale. The sky cracked open with thunder, and rain lashed the rooftops until the lanes ran like small rivers. Miss Marple, awake as always, sat knitting near the window when she saw a figure hurrying down the road, Lila Bennett, shawl drawn tight, her face pale in the lightning flashes. She carried something under her arm, a small brown case. The next morning, the vale was filled with uneasy talk. Mrs. Bennett had not returned home that night. Arthur was seen pacing the garden at dawn, his face grey and drawn. By midday, Inspector Graves's car appeared at Rosebank Cottage. 2 constables followed him inside, and though no one knew what had happened yet, every curtain in the village twitched in nervous curiosity. Miss Marple, quiet as a shadow, stood by the hedge watching the house where a bride's dream had begun, and perhaps where it had ended. As dusk fell, Mrs. Hollingworth came running into the sitting-room, breathless with excitement. "Jane, there's been a dreadful business. Arthur Bennett's wife. She's gone, left the house in the night. They say he found a letter this morning, and oh, Jane, it wasn't addressed to him at all." Miss Marple looked up, her knitting motionless in her lap. "No?" she asked softly. "Then perhaps, my dear, it wasn't only the storm that visited Ashcombe Vale last night." She turned back to the window where the last light of day flickered across the rain-drenched lane, and her eyes, calm, knowing, and faintly sorrowful, followed the empty path leading to Rosebank Cottage. Chapter 2. The Letter at Rosebank Cottage. The morning after the storm was a strange one in Ashcombe Vale. The village, washed clean by rain, gleamed with a deceptive brightness. The cobblestones glittered, the church bell rang faintly through clear air, and yet an uneasy stillness lingered, as though the vale itself knew something had gone wrong. At Rosebank Cottage, shutters remained closed, though it was nearly 10 o'clock. A few curious villagers lingered by the gate under the pretext of admiring the roses. Inside, Arthur Bennett sat slumped at the kitchen table, his untouched tea growing cold beside him. The door creaked open, and Inspector Graves stepped in. A tall, quiet man with a patient air, and a manner that suggested he had seen far too many domestic tragedies to be easily shocked. His eyes swept the room, the tidy breakfast table, a damp umbrella left by the door, a half-packed suitcase on the floor. "Well, Mr. Bennett," he said gently, taking off his hat, "I understand your wife has gone missing." Arthur looked up slowly, his voice hoarse. "She left some time in the night, Inspector. I heard nothing until I woke and found her gone. Only this." He pushed forward an envelope, its flap unsealed, its paper slightly smudged by tears or rain. Graves unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat and flowing, unmistakably foreign. "Arthur, forgive me. I cannot stay. My heart belongs elsewhere, and my duty is not here. Please do not look for me." Lila Graves read it twice, then looked up. "Did she take anything?" "A small case," Arthur murmured. "But her clothes, her jewellery, most of them are still here. Outside, through the half-open door, Miss Marple could be seen standing by the rose bushes. She had called in, by chance, as she so often did, bearing a basket of eggs from Mrs. Hollingworth's hens. Her expression, though kind, was watchful. Graves, noticing her, gave a small nod. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I recall seeing you assist the constabulary once or twice before." "Oh dear me, no," said Miss Marple modestly, stepping inside. "I merely notice things. One can hardly live in a small village without doing so." Arthur tried to smile. "Miss Marple's always been kind to my roses. Lila admired them too at first." "At first," Miss Marple repeated softly, glancing toward the drooping stems. "They do seem neglected lately." There was a pause. Outside, a robin sang brightly, heedless of sorrow. "Mr. Bennett," said Graves, "did your wife have any acquaintances here? Friends she might have confided in?" Arthur hesitated. "She met a few at the women's circle. Mrs. Copley, I think, and young Mr. Fletcher from the post office. But she never seemed close to anyone." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked faintly in her pocket as she spoke. "And yet she was often in Brindleford, was she not?" Arthur turned sharply. "Yes. How did you—" "I happened to notice, Mr. Bennett, that the bus to Brindleford passes by my cousin's cottage twice daily. Mrs. Bennett often took the noon one and returned near dusk. I thought perhaps she had joined some evening class." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Evening class?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "So she told Mrs. Copley at the post office, I believe. English literature, though I fancy it may have been something rather different." Graves tucked the letter into an envelope. "I'll make inquiries at the station. If she boarded a train last night, someone will have seen her. In the meantime, Mr. Bennett, you should rest." But Arthur Bennett did not rest. When the inspector left, he remained seated by the window, staring at the empty lane, as if expecting his wife to reappear. Miss Marple lingered, rearranging the roses in a jug on the mantelpiece. "She was very young," Miss Marple said softly. "It must be difficult for a girl to leave her own country, to live in a place so quiet." Arthur sighed. "I tried to make her happy. New clothes, trips to town. I even bought her that little gramophone. But she changed, Miss Marple. There were phone calls. I'd walk into the room and she'd hang up. Sometimes she'd cry, other times she'd laugh at nothing. I thought it was just loneliness. I never imagined—" He stopped, his voice breaking. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his arm. "People often hide their unhappiness, Mr. Bennett, but the truth has a way of coming out, even when one least expects it." As she stepped outside into the clear morning air, Miss Marple paused by the gate. Her eyes fell upon something half buried in the damp earth, a scrap of blue ribbon, fine silk, caught in a thorn of the rosebush. She lifted it delicately. It was faintly scented, not with perfume, but with smoke. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with her cousin Vera. Naturally, the conversation turned to the Bennets. "They say she's gone back to London," Vera declared, eyes bright with gossip. "Someone saw a woman matching her description at Brindleford station with a small case." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "though I wonder why she would leave in the middle of a thunderstorm." "Oh, you always see mysteries where there aren't any," Vera laughed. Miss Marple smiled but said nothing. She was thinking of that ribbon, of its smoky scent, and of a curious detail she had noticed in Rosebank Cottage, the faint marks of muddy footprints near the back door, not leading out, but in. That evening, as dusk settled over Ashcombe Vale, Arthur Bennett sat once more by the window. The clock ticked softly. Outside, the roses stirred faintly in the wind. Then, from the quiet, came a sound, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Arthur rose slowly, his heart quickening. He moved to the door, hand trembling on the latch, but when he opened it, there was no one there, only the night breeze carrying the scent of rain and something else, something faint, metallic, and terrible. From her cottage across the lane, Miss Marple looked up from her knitting and frowned. The Vale was too quiet again. And in her experience, such silence usually meant only one thing. Something dreadful was about to be discovered. Chapter 3. The Scent of Smoke. The following morning dawned pale and windless over Ashcombe Vale, the kind of morning that makes a village seem frozen between sleep and waking. The mist clung to the hedgerows, the postman's bicycle bell sounded faint and far, and somewhere a milk churn rattled in the distance. Yet beneath the quiet unease had settled like a low fog. For the first time in years, the little village seemed divided between curiosity and fear. Was Lila Bennett merely a runaway bride, or had something far worse happened at Rosebank Cottage? Miss Marple, sitting at the breakfast table in Mrs. Vera Hollingworth's cheerful kitchen, stirred her tea gently. Across from her, Vera spoke with the satisfaction of someone who knew half the story but longed for the rest. "They say Inspector Graves was back at the cottage before dawn," she began. "Apparently there was something found in the garden, a handkerchief, scorched at the corner." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Scorched, you say? How odd. We've not had an open fire outside since the village bonfire." "Exactly, but that's not all." Vera leaned closer. "Mrs. Copley swears she saw smoke rising behind the Bennet's house just before midnight. Thought perhaps he was burning rubbish, but honestly, Jane, who burns rubbish in a thunderstorm?" Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Her blue eyes, gentle but keen, turned toward the window where the morning mist was lifting over the lane. "No one sensible, my dear. Unless, of course, they wish to destroy something in a hurry." Vera blinked. "You mean?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I mean nothing at all. Merely that people often underestimate what can be learned from smoke." Later that morning, Miss Marple set out along the lane toward Rosebank Cottage. The rain of the previous days had left the path soft underfoot, and a faint scent of damp roses lingered in the air. Inspector Graves was already there, speaking with Constable Rigby, who was digging near the back fence. "Good morning, Inspector." Miss Marple greeted him politely, as though visiting a neighbour rather than a potential crime scene. Graves turned, a touch of fatigue in his eyes, but a trace of respect in his voice. "Morning, Miss Marple. I thought I might find you here sooner or later." "I only wondered how poor Mr. Bennett was faring," she said softly, glancing toward the cottage. "Loneliness can make one quite desperate, you know." Graves nodded. "He's inside. Won't leave that chair by the window. Keep saying she'll come back." Miss Marple sighed. "Men of kind hearts are so easily deceived. But tell me, did you happen to find anything last night?" Graves hesitated, then handed her a small evidence envelope. Inside was a fragment of fabric, blue silk, singed at the edge. Miss Marple recognized it instantly as part of the ribbon she had found caught on the rosebush. "It was found in the ashes behind the house," Graves explained. "Seems someone burned a pile of clothes and papers in the storm. We also found a melted bangle among the cinders. Gold. Mr. Bennett says it belonged to his wife." Miss Marple studied the fragment. "So there was smoke after all," she murmured. "And perhaps not merely from rubbish." Graves gave her a cautious look. "You think something's happened to her?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people seldom burn what they intend to keep." Inside the cottage, Arthur Bennett sat hunched by the window, his hands trembling around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. His eyes were bloodshot, his face lined with sleeplessness. When Miss Marple entered, he tried to stand but failed. "She's not gone, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "She can't be. She promised me she'd never leave without a word." "She did leave a letter," Miss Marple said kindly. "But I wonder, Mr. Bennett, was it written as freely as it appears?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "The tone, my dear. The words were calm, too calm for a woman leaving her husband in the middle of the night. There was no trace of fear, no apology, no urgency, only closure. And women rarely write closure when they are running away. They write confusion, regret, or panic." Arthur looked at her helplessly. "Then who could have written it?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "That is what I intend to find out." Her eyes drifted toward the hearth. On the mantelpiece stood a small brass candlestick, its polish dulled and streaked as though recently cleaned in haste. And beside it, a faint brown stain along the edge of the carpet, small, irregular, but unmistakable. "I see you've had trouble with the floorboards," Miss Marple remarked casually. Arthur followed her gaze. "Oh, yes, a loose plank. I hammered it down this morning." "How diligent of you," she said gently, "though you might consider letting it breathe. Fresh air does wonders for a damp floor." He looked puzzled, but she turned away, smoothing her gloves. "You've been through quite enough, Mr. Bennett. Try to rest. I dare say truth has a way of finding its way through cracks just as water does." That evening, Miss Marple sat knitting by the hearth at Mrs. Hollingworth's cottage while the rain began again. Vera chattered about the vicar's sermon, the grocer's new assistant, and a rumour that someone from the London papers might come to write about the foreign bride of Ashcombe Vale. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Her mind, sharp as her knitting needles, replayed every detail of Rosebank Cottage, the singed ribbon, the faint smell of smoke, the polished candlestick, the hammering sound that must have followed it. When Vera finally noticed her cousin's silence, she said, "You're thinking again, Jane. You always get that look before something dreadful comes out." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes on the rain-streaked window. "Dreadful? Oh, perhaps. But truth, my dear Vera, is often rather dreadful when it concerns love, especially when love turns to resentment, and resentment to rage." The clock ticked softly, and somewhere outside a dog barked once before falling silent. Miss Marple's knitting paused. "I should very much like to know," she said quietly, "why the good Mr. Bennett felt it necessary to hammer down a floorboard that wasn't loose until this morning." Chapter 4. What Lies Beneath. The following day dawned with a dull, pewter sky. Clouds hung low over Ashcombe Vale, pressing down upon the village like a heavy thought that no one wished to voice. Word had spread quietly. Inspector Graves had returned to Rosebank Cottage, and this time he had brought 2 constables with shovels. Miss Marple watched from the window of Mrs. Vera Hollingworth's parlour as the men moved through the garden, their boots leaving dark impressions in the wet soil. Vera, of course, could not contain her curiosity. "Honestly, Jane, the way people talk. Mrs. Copley swears it's a drainage problem, and Mr. Fitch says it's the roses he's having dug up. But I know that look on Inspector Graves's face. It's not gardening he's after." Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly. "No, my dear, I dare say it isn't." At Rosebank Cottage, Inspector Graves crouched near the flower-bed beside the back path. The soil was disturbed in an oddly uneven way, as though someone had dug hastily and filled the hole again. He straightened as Constable Rigby came forward, holding a small spade. "Here, sir," Rigby said. "The earth's loose just here, softer than the rest." Graves gave a grim nod. "Careful now." Within minutes, the unmistakable outline of something wrapped in fabric began to appear, first pale, then darkened with moisture. The constables exchanged uneasy glances. Graves's expression did not change, but his voice grew very low. "Fetch Miss Marple," he said quietly. "She'll want to see this." Miss Marple arrived half an hour later, shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. The lane was nearly empty now. Only a few villagers lingered at a distance, whispering behind hedges. The constables stepped aside as she approached the garden, her face calm though her eyes were grave. "I'm afraid it's as you thought," Inspector Graves said softly. "We've found her." The site was mercifully covered, but the truth was unmistakable. Beneath the rose bushes lay the remains of Lila Bennett, her body wrapped in a faded bedsheet. There was a moment of deep silence. The roses, so bright and fragrant only weeks before, drooped in the damp air as though mourning. "I dare say," Miss Marple murmured. "The poor girl was closer to home than anyone believed." Inside the cottage, Arthur Bennett sat rigidly at the kitchen table as Graves entered. He did not ask questions. His hands were clasped together, trembling slightly, but his voice was curiously steady. "She's dead, then?" he said flatly. "Yes," Graves replied. "We found her behind the house. Would you care to explain how she came to be there?" Arthur's shoulders sagged, the fight gone out of him. "I don't know what to say. I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple, who had quietly stepped into the doorway, regarded him with deep compassion but also unflinching clarity. "Perhaps, Mr. Bennett," she said gently, "you could start with the truth. That is usually the simplest place to begin." He drew a shaky breath. "She wanted to leave me. I knew it. There was someone else. I found her letters, hidden in the drawer. She'd been writing to a man back in Ceylon. He was waiting for her. I couldn't stand it. After everything I'd given her, the house, the money, the chance at a life here." His voice broke, and his hands gripped the edge of the table. "I confronted her that night. She laughed at me, said I was old, said she'd only ever pitied me." Graves's tone was firm but not unkind. And then Arthur's eyes filled with despair. "It happened so fast. I don't even remember picking it up at the candlestick. She fell, hit her head on the hearth. There was so much blood. I didn't mean it. I thought, if I hid her—" He stopped. The words turned to a choked whisper. I burned her things, the letters, the dress she wore. I thought the rain would hide everything." Miss Marple looked toward the mantelpiece, where the candlestick still stood. Its brass gleamed faintly in the grey light. "The truth, Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "is seldom as merciful as we wish, but it is always the only thing worth facing." When the confession was finished, Graves led the broken man away. Outside, the lane was lined with silent villagers. Some looked shocked, others merely solemn. In Ashcombe Vale, gossip had become grief. That evening, Miss Marple and Mrs. Hollingworth sat together in the quiet parlour. Vera, subdued for once, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "Poor man, poor foolish man, to think it all began with love." Miss Marple nodded. "Love, yes, but not the kind that forgives. He loved her as one might love a painting, something to be owned and kept close, and she, poor child, mistook opportunity for affection." She looked out of the window where dusk was falling over the vale. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling softly into the evening sky. Smoke that smelled of supper, not secrets. "People are so very fragile, Vera," Miss Marple said quietly. "All it takes is a little loneliness and a little pride, and the best intentions turn to ruin." The clock struck 7. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang faintly through the rain. Miss Marple's needles clicked once more, steady and rhythmic, as she murmured almost to herself, "Roses will bloom again next spring, but the ground beneath them will never forget." Chapter 5. The Whisper of Pity. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the village of Ashcombe Vale wrapped in that soft, uneasy quiet that often follows a storm, as though the world itself were catching its breath. The roses at Rosebank Cottage were drooping, heavy with raindrops and silence. The newspapers had arrived from Brindleford, carrying the news in careful, respectable print. "Local man confesses to wife's murder in Ashcombe Vale." Tragedy to most, that headline said everything. But Miss Marple, sitting at the breakfast table with her knitting on her lap, did not seem convinced that the story was quite so simple. "Justice will take its course," declared Mrs. Vera Hollingworth, pouring tea as though her own steady hand could set the village right again. "Arthur Bennett will stand trial and everyone can move on. Dreadful business, of course, but these things happen when one marries in haste. Poor man. I can't help but pity him." "Pity," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly. "Yes, that's the word, isn't it? The one most people overlook." Vera frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple looked up. He said she pitied him. Not hated, not deceived, but pitied. That struck me as rather odd. You see, True cruelty seldom comes from pity. There's something about that word that feels wrong. That afternoon, Inspector Graves stopped by Mrs. Hollingworth's cottage. His hat and coat were damp from the mist, his expression drawn. "I've just come from the station," he told Miss Marple. "Bennett's quiet, cooperative, but he keeps insisting she wasn't afraid. Says she stood there calm as you please, even when he accused her." Miss Marple folded her hands, thoughtful. "Calm, you say? That's strange. Women in danger don't stand calm unless they believe they're in control, or unless they think someone else is." Graves looked at her sharply. "You think someone else was involved?" "Oh, I never think, Inspector," Miss Marple said mildly. "I merely observe, and I did observe one curious thing." Graves tilted his head. "And what was that?" "The key to the garden gate," she said quietly. "It was missing when I last visited Rosebank Cottage. Mr. Bennett told me he'd misplaced it, but I rather think he didn't." By late afternoon, the Vale was again humming with whispers. Mrs. Copley at the post office reported that a young man from Brindleford had been visiting the cottage regularly in the weeks before the murder. Someone with dark hair, well-dressed, and always asking for Mrs. Bennett. Inspector Graves went at once to Brindleford, while Miss Marple took her slow, deliberate walk through the village lanes, her umbrella tapping lightly against the gravel. She paused outside Rosebank Cottage, gazing at the house where tragedy had rooted itself, like ivy. The back gate creaked faintly in the wind. She looked closer. There, wedged in the hinge, was something small and metallic, a key dulled by rain and streaked with rust. Miss Marple picked it up delicately, turning it over in her gloved hand. "So," she murmured, "someone did return it after all." That evening, Inspector Graves returned, his expression grim. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said. "There was someone else, a Mr. Edmund Ware. Young man, 28, from Brindleford. Clerk at the shipping firm where Lila had applied for work. He's been gone for days. The neighbours said he left town suddenly after the news broke." Miss Marple gave a faint nod. "Did Mr. Bennett ever mention him?" "No, but we found a letter in the post office, undelivered. It's addressed to Mrs. Bennett, posted the day before she died. Would you like to hear it?" Graves unfolded the paper and read aloud. "My dearest Lila, you must not delay. The papers will be ready by Thursday. When you are free, write to me and I'll send for you. We'll start fresh, as we planned. Trust me. E.W." Mrs. Hollingworth gasped. So she was planning to run away after all. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple softly. "But if she was planning to leave on Thursday, why would she quarrel with her husband Wednesday night?" Graves blinked. "You think someone else forced that confrontation?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but sharp. "I think, Inspector, that sometimes the most dangerous pity isn't from a husband. It's from a man who pretends to rescue what he intends to ruin." That night, rain began to fall again, slow and persistent. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, listening to the drops against the glass. The key to the garden gate lay on her dressing table beside a folded handkerchief. She touched both, thoughtfully. "People always lock the wrong doors," she murmured, "and sometimes they open them for the wrong person." Outside, the lane of Ashcombe Vale lay silent once more. But Miss Marple knew silence rarely meant peace. It was only the hush before the truth began to speak. Chapter 6. Shadows from Brindleford. The following morning broke cold and colourless, the kind of grey English dawn that made the rooftops of Ashcombe Vale look like sketches in pencil. Mist rose from the fields beyond the churchyard, swallowing the hedgerows in a quiet that felt almost watchful. Miss Marple, as was her habit, took her early walk before breakfast. The road toward Rosebank Cottage was slick with dew, and a blackbird hopped nervously along the gatepost. She paused near the garden, looking at the place where the soil had been disturbed and relaid. The roses, now replanted by the constables, seemed almost indecently bright against the damp earth. "Poor child," she murmured. buried among the very flowers she was promised. She turned as she heard footsteps. Inspector Graves, hat in hand, was making his way up the lane from the vicarage. His expression told her he hadn't slept. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, though there was little morning cheer in his tone. "We've had word from Brindleford. Edmund Ware's been found." "Ah," Miss Marple said quietly. "Alive, I hope." "Alive, yes, and quite surprised to see us. He'd been staying at a small lodging house near the station, claims he knew nothing about the murder." "Men who run away rarely know nothing," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes twinkling faintly. "They simply hope distance will change the truth's shape." By late morning, Inspector Graves had brought Edmund Ware to the small interview room at the Brindleford station. Miss Marple, invited as an observer, sat quietly in the corner with her knitting bag resting neatly on her lap. Ware was strikingly handsome, dark-haired, smooth-faced, and possessed of that easy self-assurance that comes naturally to charmers and scoundrels alike. He smiled politely at Miss Marple before turning to Graves. "I suppose you've brought me here because of poor Mrs. Bennett," he said. "A dreadful business. I read about it in the paper, you know." Graves fixed him with a steady look. "You corresponded with her?" Ware shrugged. "A few letters, perhaps. She was lonely, I was sympathetic. There was nothing improper." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Sympathy," she murmured. "An excellent disguise for ambition." Ware looked at her sharply. "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, nothing at all, Mr. Ware," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I merely thought of how often one hears of kind young men helping lonely women with paperwork. So useful, those shipping forms." He coloured slightly, but said nothing. Graves opened a folder and drew out the letter found at the post office. "You wrote this, didn't you?" Ware glanced at it, his tone smooth. "Yes." "But it was harmless. She wanted to find work, to earn her own way. I only offered to help." "Help to leave her husband?" Graves pressed. "Of course not," Ware snapped. "She spoke of going back home. She wasn't happy in that house. The man was decades older, jealous, possessive. She said he watched her constantly." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Did she say she was afraid of him, Mr. Ware?" There was a pause. "No," he admitted slowly. "She said she pitied him." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Yes, that word again." When the questioning ended, Ware was released pending further inquiry. As he left, Miss Marple quietly followed Inspector Graves into the corridor. "Well?" he asked. "I believe he tells the truth, at least the kind of truth that hides a lie behind it," Miss Marple said. "He may not have killed her with his own hands, but I fancy his heart was guilty long before her death." Graves frowned. "You think he pushed her toward it?" Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Lonely women are easily persuaded when flattery wears the face of rescue. She believed he loved her, and he—" she paused, eyes soft with pity. "He saw her as a means to an end. Perhaps money, perhaps passage, perhaps both." Graves sighed. "We'll dig into his background. But what of Bennett? You don't think he's lying?" "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I think he told the truth as he remembers it. Only his memory has shaded it with pain. He believed she mocked him, that she confessed her betrayal to his face. But I wonder, perhaps those weren't her words at all." Graves looked puzzled. "Whose then?" "The words of a letter," Miss Marple said simply. "One he wasn't meant to read." That afternoon Miss Marple returned to Ashcombe Vale. The vicar's wife stopped her by the green, full of anxious curiosity. "They say the young man was found. Does that mean it wasn't poor Mr. Bennett after all?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Fallow, murder is rarely so neat. Sometimes guilt grows on several branches before one breaks under its weight." She walked on toward Mrs. Hollingworth's cottage, her steps slow and thoughtful. Inside, Vera was trimming flowers for the church altar. "Well, Jane?" she demanded the moment Miss Marple entered. "Is it true? Have they caught the lover?" "Not caught. Miss Marple said mildly. "But found. He's quite the charming type by all accounts, the sort of man who mistakes manipulation for kindness." Vera huffed. "I can't see what more there is to learn. The husband confessed, didn't he?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, setting her gloves aside. "And yet confessions, like mirrors, don't always reflect the whole room." That night, long after the church clock struck 10, Miss Marple sat awake, her small lamp casting a pool of golden light on her notebook. In neat handwriting she listed the pieces she had gathered: a letter written before the murder, a missing garden key returned after, a man who fled but claimed innocence, a husband who confessed yet left signs of something unplanned. She closed the notebook gently. The logic of human emotion, she knew, was rarely tidy, but one truth had begun to crystallize in her mind: that Lila Bennett's death was not the result of one person's rage, but of several people's selfishness colliding at the wrong moment. Miss Marple rose, drew the curtains, and looked out over the sleeping village. In the distance, the faint glow of Rosebank Cottage still lingered from the constable's lanterns. "Evil rarely begins with hate," she whispered. "More often it begins with someone being terribly lonely." Chapter 7. Truth Among the Roses. Ashcombe Vale had settled into a grim quiet after the arrest. The newspapers had stopped printing new theories, the villagers had returned to their routines, and Rosebank Cottage stood shuttered and silent, a house both pitied and feared. Yet Miss Marple, as she often said, never trusted peace that came too soon after trouble. The morning was bright and deceptively calm when Inspector Graves called at Mrs. Hollingworth's cottage once again. His usually composed manner carried an edge of frustration. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said briskly. "I've just returned from Brindleford. Ware's story doesn't sit right. He insists he never saw Mrs. Bennet after the Tuesday, before her death. Claims he sent the letter but never received a reply." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "That's curious, Inspector, because Mrs. Bennet was alive on Wednesday night. So if she never answered, who might have read it?" Graves frowned. "You think the husband found it first?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that it found him, and what's more, I believe someone wanted it to." That afternoon, Miss Marple persuaded Graves to take her once more to Rosebank Cottage. The air around the house felt still, almost heavy, as though it retained every word ever shouted within its walls. The constables had cleared most of the evidence, but the scent of smoke still lingered faintly, mixed with damp earth and roses. Miss Marple moved slowly through the rooms, not searching but listening. Her eyes travelled across the table, the mantelpiece, the stairway. Then she stopped. "Inspector," she said softly, "you mentioned before that Mrs. Bennet's things were burned. Did anyone note what was missing?" Graves shook his head. "Only that some dresses, papers, and letters were destroyed." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, touching the mantel with one gloved hand, "but not all the letters." She reached behind the small vase of dried lavender and drew out a corner of folded paper, yellowed and brittle from heat. The top was half burnt, but enough remained to reveal a single line in neat, slanted handwriting. "He must not know, not until the ship sails." Graves read it over her shoulder. Good heavens! So she wasn't leaving to go home. She was planning to run away with him. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but not immediately. And that's what makes the timing so strange. If she intended to flee in a few days, why provoke her husband the night before?" Graves sighed. "You think someone else put that letter where he'd find it?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. "I think the letter was never meant for Lila at all. It was meant for Arthur Bennett." That evening, as dusk fell, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Brindleford station where Edmund Ware was still being questioned. She entered the small, dimly lit room with her usual calm politeness. "Good evening, Mr. Ware," she said. "I hope you don't mind an old woman's curiosity." He looked up, startled. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Have they sent you to frighten me again?" "Oh, "Dear me, no," she said, settling her gloves on the table. "I merely wondered whether you might help me understand something. You see, letters are such delicate things. They can ruin people quite unintentionally." He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Miss Marple continued gently. "I believe you knew that Mrs. Bennet's husband might read your letter. Perhaps you even wanted him to. A jealous man, a passionate young woman. A quarrel was inevitable. You needn't have lifted a hand to cause it." Ware's composure wavered. "You can't prove that." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But you know it's true. You sent that letter to force her hand, to make her leave sooner, before she could change her mind. You didn't mean to kill her, Mr. Ware. You only meant to break the cage." Ware's voice cracked. "She promised me she'd come. I waited. She never came. I thought she'd chosen him over me. I didn't mean—" His words fell into silence. Miss Marple's expression was kind, almost sorrowful. "Yes, you didn't mean to. Most tragedies begin that way." Later, Miss Marple and Inspector Graves walked out into the night. The lamps along the street flickered softly, their light glancing off puddles on the cobbles. "So that's it," Graves said. "He sent the letter knowing the husband would find it, stirred his jealousy, provoked the quarrel, and left her to face the consequences. Manipulation by post." Miss Marple nodded. "A crueler kind of murder. One that stains the conscience, not the hands. Poor Arthur acted out of pain, not malice. But the young man, he planned his words like poison." Graves sighed deeply. "The law won't touch him. He'll walk free." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "But guilt has longer arms than justice, Inspector. It keeps its hold long after the gallows are gone." They paused by the garden gate of Rosebank Cottage. The roses stirred faintly in the breeze, their petals pale in the lamplight. Miss Marple bent and touched one bloom, now bruised by rain. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, "Lila Bennett was never killed in anger. She was killed in the space between two selfish hearts, one that wanted to own her and one that wanted to use her." Graves looked at her quietly. "And you, Miss Marple? What will you tell the village?" "Oh, nothing at all," she said with a faint smile. "They prefer their tragedies tidy. Best to let them believe she ran away from love, rather than that love itself ran away from her." She turned, her figure small but steady in the lamplight, walking back toward the lane where the night folded gently over the quiet roots of Ashcombe Vale. Chapter 8. The Roses Remember. Summer returned slowly to Ashcombe Vale, as though the village itself needed time to forget. The roses at Rosebank Cottage had begun to bloom again, shyly at first, then in wild profusion, as if eager to reclaim the ground that had seen such sorrow. Most of the villagers avoided that stretch of lane now, lowering their voices as they passed, but not Miss Marple. She walked there often, quietly, almost tenderly, as though tending the memory of something that still deserved kindness. It had been 3 weeks since Arthur Bennett's trial. The court, moved by Miss Marple's testimony and the evidence she and Inspector Graves had uncovered, accepted that the killing had not been planned. Arthur was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, and his face, when the verdict was read, had carried the strange calm of a man both punished and released. Edmund Ware had vanished from public life. He was not charged. There was no law for the cruelty of the heart, but his reputation was quietly destroyed. His employers dismissed him. His name became the sort people no longer mentioned in polite company. And when Miss Marple once asked Graves what had become of him, he only said, "He's left England." "Then he'll take his conscience with him," Miss Marple replied softly. "It's a heavier companion than most realize." That evening, Mrs. Vera Hollingworth hosted one of her usual teas. It was the first gathering since the tragedy, and though the talk was light, there was an unspoken hope that normal life might resume. "I must say," Vera sighed, handing Miss Marple a scone, "the whole business has made people frightfully cautious about taking lodgers and marrying foreigners. Mrs. Copley says she'll never trust anyone from further than Bristol again. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I dare say Mrs. Copley will recover in time. Fear has a way of pretending to be wisdom. Still, Vera went on, I can't help thinking poor Arthur brought it upon himself. Falling in love so suddenly and with someone so young, it was bound to end badly. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Oh, my dear, love is neither young nor old. It's simply what happens when loneliness mistakes kindness for devotion. One cannot blame a man for wanting company when he's spent years in silence. Vera sighed, shaking her head. You do always find a gentler way of putting things, Jane. But you're right, of course. Everyone's lonely in their own fashion. As evening deepened, Miss Marple walked home alone. The sun was low over the hills, turning the rooftops of Ashcombe Vale to gold. She stopped, as she always did, outside Rosebank Cottage. The gate, freshly mended, creaked softly in the breeze. The house no longer looked tragic, just quiet. Through the window she could see faint dust dancing in the orange light, and the roses swayed gently against the wall. She bent down to brush her fingers over one of them. A deep crimson bloom, rich and fragrant. Strange, she murmured, how they always return, no matter what's buried beneath. Footsteps sounded behind her. It was Inspector Graves walking back from the vicarage. Evening, Miss Marple, he greeted. Still haunting the scene, are you? Just saying good-night to the roses, she said, smiling. They've seen more of human nature than most of us ever will. He chuckled softly, then grew thoughtful. You know, I've been thinking about what you said in court, about how two men's selfishness can kill without either of them meaning murder. It's a strange sort of justice when only one pays. Miss Marple looked up at the sky, where the last streaks of daylight were fading. Justice, Inspector, is a clumsy word for what life does naturally. The law punishes the hand that strikes, but time punishes the heart that plotted. Edmund Ware will find no peace in any country, and poor Mr. Bennett will find it only when he forgives himself. Graves nodded slowly. You always make tragedy sound almost merciful. Miss Marple smiled. Mercy, like roses, grows best in soil that's been broken. Later that night, she sat by her bedroom window at Mrs. Hollingworth's cottage, her knitting folded neatly beside her. The moonlight fell silver across the village roofs. Somewhere, a nightingale was singing again, the same as it had on the night the truth was found. She opened her small notebook, the one she carried in every case, and wrote a single line before closing it again. Loneliness is the seed from which the unkindest acts often grow, yet even from such soil, kindness can still bloom. Then she blew out the lamp, and the room fell into peaceful darkness. Outside, the roses of Ashcombe Vale swayed in the wind, silent witnesses, fragrant and forgiving, keeping their secrets as gently as Miss Marple herself.